Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Joe Sugars from Olympus UK, and today I'm going to walk you through best practice for black and white photography on the Olympus cameras. So there's a really nice ability within the Olympus cameras to be able to customize what you're shooting while you're shooting it. So I'm going to run you through that today. Today is going to be 3 sections. So I'm going to do a little bit of PowerPoint on black and white, best approach, where it works best. I'm then going to show you how to do that on the cameras, and then I've got a little live demo just to show you the differences, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end of that. But there'll be little gaps for all of you to ask questions as and when. Okay, so we're all good to start now, so let me share my PowerPoint screen. Just grab that. There we go. Brilliant. Okay, so black and white photography. Give it a second to kick in. Brilliant. Okay, so black and white photography. So photography surprisingly started in 1829. So that's the first image to be fixed to a piece of glass. So originally photography, I think it probably goes right back to the Egyptians and things like the camera obscura. So you can go right before Christ to find the first kind of history of image making, or certainly the use of optical technology that would then become cameras. So the first camera obscuras were made by the Egyptians, and then a camera obscura, you can do that in your front living room. All you have to do is mask out your windows, put a tiny aperture hole in the board that you're going to mask the windows out with, and then on the opposite wall you have an inverted upside down image of the outside world. And I'm sure the Egyptians were actually blown away by this experience when they saw it. They must have thought it was some sort of form of magic. And then as obviously lens technology developed in the Renaissance period, there's definitely a shift towards the reproduction of art changing. There's a big theory that that painting definitely changed in the 15th and 16th century due to people using optics coming out of Amsterdam to again be able to refract an image from a lens onto a darkened box and then be able to draw it 2D. But the first photographs were basically obviously using silver and silver halide solutions. And the first person was Louis Daguerre. And the daguerreotype was basically onto a sheet of glass. Interestingly, his cousin had actually been playing around with the process for a couple of years, but he wasn't able to make the image actually stick to the glass. But the daguerreotype was the very first image produced. Then 10 years later, you've got Fox Talbot, who often we give the nod for inventing photography, being British. He's the first person to produce a paper negative. So he's the first person to be able to produce something that wasn't just a one-off image like a painting. You could mass produce images if you wanted to. And when you look at his images, you do see that he is using some very fine quality optics to produce these. Obviously, being an aristocrat, he was probably able to afford a little bit better glass than the French guys who were sort of playing around with it as hobbyists. And then in 1885, you get a big jump forward with George Eastman. And George Eastman basically went on to become Kodak. And he was the first person to make a roll film. But again, this was on paper. This was basically the creation of the box brownie and the sort of modern photographic industry as we see it. But the problem was with paper negatives, particularly with movie making. So people like Charlie Chaplin and all of the Hollywood, early Hollywood scene, they had real problems with paper because it obviously tore so easily. So the frame rates couldn't be that high. And they were definitely looking for a better solution. And the better solution was to obviously go to plastic negatives. But as you're probably aware, back in the day, they were incredibly dangerous. They had a habit of having chemical reactions and exploding, very easy to catch fire. So the first, in brackets, safety film was introduced to the market by Kodak in 1908. And then you got your very first color film in 1942. So you've got a sort of 120-year period of the black and white before color even existed. But I would say that colour, really, even seeing Second World War seems kind of strange, seeing colour images. Colour really kicks in for me in probably the 70s, to be honest with you. And the reason it does, you've got that huge period of black and white, is because colour temperature was very difficult to reproduce. A lot of these colour films had very inaccurate colours. They were very slow exposure. So they really limited what you could do photographically. So the black and white negative and film speeds obviously meant that that rolled right on into the 70s. So photography, for most of its history, has actually been a black and white medium. Classic black and white photographers. If you don't recognize anyone on this list, please go look them up. Like I said, you guys will have a copy of this presentation, so I would highly recommend that you check out any of these photographers if you don't know them. 1 second, I'm just getting a question. I'll just hold there, 1 second. Sorry, I can't see your question. I'll come to the questions when I finish this one section. Okay, so yeah, classic black and white photographers. So Ansel Adams is top of the list for me. Walking around Yosemite's Park with a 10-8 camera, he was essential in presenting the wild wests of America, the size and the sheer drama of the country. He obviously was carrying these large format cameras around on a donkey and producing these beautiful high contrast one-to-one prints. The detail, if you ever get a chance to see an Ansel Adams original print, they are beautifully produced. And again, it means that photography was moving in a different direction from painting. Traditionally, if you had a lot of money and you wanted a portrait or your lands or your house depicted, you would have a portrait painter like Constable or a landscape painter like Turner or Constable come along and produce an image of you with your landscape. But then Ansel Adams comes along and changes that kind of format. Photography then becomes the large American art form, which it predominantly really is. As an America as a young country had embraced abstract painting, but it was still finding its feet. And I feel photography was very much an American art form. And then you've got people like Robert Frank, probably one of the first best kind of street photographers. Walker Evans, a documentary photographer, very much famous for photographing the American Depression and the Dust Bowl, along with Dorothy Lang. Again, really wonderful, classic, iconic images of middle of America before the sort of industrial age really picked up in America. Then you got Cartier-Bresson, probably the greatest original photographer from back in the day. They came up with things like the decisive moment, came from a very fine art kind of philosophical background. There's a couple of books well worth reading by Cartier-Bresson, and I always liked the idea, again leaning towards art, that he saw photography as very much sketching out ideas. And again, looking for that decisive moment with or without what I call the kind of red balloon moment. And then you've got people like Robert Capa, one of the first war photographers, truly mind-blowing images there. He was involved very much with the landing on D-Day and all this sort of stuff. Quite a hero of a photographer, very interesting life story. And then my personal favorite, Don McCullum. When I was 14 in 1994, I got to see an exhibition of his Sarajevo work, and it definitely changed the direction for me as a photographer. I realized that photography could speak to people in a far bigger way than album covers and sort of gig photography and general wedding photography. Don McCullum really showed me the kind of drama and the kind of more harrowing nature that you can express through photography. And then something completely different, someone like Newman, which is a very much a fine art photography. You're looking at still lives, and again, it's all about the subject and how it's presented, the curves and the shapes and how it's lit. So well worth a look if you don't know. Okay, so why black and white and not color? Okay, well, for one, it improves focus on the subject by making it more subjective. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, as humans, we see everything in color. And when you change it into black and white, you are changing that relationship that we have to images. We're so used to seeing complementary colors sat next to each other, greens next to reds, or blues against reds, or kind of black against a blue. There's always these heavy contrasts that we can create as photographers using color. But when you take away that, black and white becomes all about the line and the space. And again, it means you have to focus on the actual subject that you're looking at. It improves bad lighting. So many photos that I've taken without flash indoors, where you've got that horrible lamp tungsten light, where everything looks very yellow and there's no real definition. Black and white gets rid of all of that. I did a lot of photography in my younger days in nightclubs and places like that. And again, the colors would be awful. But if you make it a black and white, it becomes more subjective. But also talking about bad lighting, for me personally, nearly everything I shoot is black and white. And the reason why is probably because I'll only accept color images if the colors are completely saturated and they have no white bleed. So when I'm talking about bad lighting, I'm talking about anything where the sun is over a 30 or 40 degree angle. Because as soon as it starts to get above that kind of early morning or late evening light, the shadows aren't sharp and the colors are all burnt out. So again, black and white, if you want to shoot in the middle of the day, if you want to be on holiday shooting stuff like architecture that you just can't get to in the evenings, black and white gets rid of all of this problem. It becomes a line exercise. Documentary. So traditionally, most documentary photography is black and white. All of the sort of iconic stuff by sort of Don McCullum is obviously all film, all black and white. And even people like Martin Parr, when they started out on their journey, they started out in black and white documentary. Obviously, he moved completely into that snapshot kind of color look, which is a great style of photography. But for me, my heart always lies with the black and white. It feels more weighty, it has more gravitas to it. Okay, it makes the world more surreal. What do I mean by that? I have a phrase for it called natural surrealism, where I'm not doing anything with Photoshop. I'm not playing around with particularly wide lenses or distortions, but what you're doing by taking the color out and particularly using things like water, like the example next to on this page, what you're doing is you're changing the way people look at the picture. It becomes more surreal because I can't identify what or how. The image you're looking at here, it was shot with the 300mm. This was a pond down in Guildford somewhere. And again, I've zoomed right in on some flowers and some lilies that were right in the middle of the pond. And it completely changes the context. It feels more like a Japanese ink drawing or something along those lines. Again, it's got a nice dose of natural surrealism. It also has a more romantic look to it. When I was a wedding photographer back in the old film days, I would generally shoot 60-40 if I had the choice, 60 being 60% black and white, because it just lends to romance. It not only is it forgiving on the skin and you can overexpose to make things look nicer, you don't have that puffy redness that a lot of people have on a wedding day where they're all stressed out and they've had too much to drink. But also when you're shooting in venues, it means things like I don't know, fire hydrants, general utilities that you don't really want in the picture. When they're in black and white, you just don't notice them more. Whereas in real life, they're all painted red and yellow. So again, it's very forgiving on the environment around it. And again, I feel it just looks a little bit more artistic. You're giving yourself a bit more of a challenge by shooting in black and white. Okay, so here's some examples. The eye is drawn to the subject. So the subject on the left, this was shot using the 45mm, and I was shooting pretty wide open. I think it's somewhere around 2.8 or something like that. Quite a bright day. And this was one of those photo walks that I do, well, back before COVID-19, and this was over in Bristol. So this was one of their big carnivals, and they're wonderful to shoot these sort of events because there's so much going on. People are distracted. There's so many exciting images to be captured. And this lady here was just wandering through the crowd. She caught my eye. I kind of smiled at her. She looked at me, and then she looked away. And as she looked away, I brought my camera to my eye and took the picture. If this was a color image, the people in the background, you don't really notice them too much when it's a black and white. But in color, it's incredibly glary, that background. The white's burnt out, the colors are all a bit leery, and it doesn't isolate the lady, which is what I'm interested in the shot. To the right, there's a completely different kind of use of black and white. So this was over in the Caribbean. I'm pretty sure this was Costa Rica. incredibly warm part of the world. And I was doing working on the cruise ships at this point in my life. And again, shooting in the middle of the day, but also because there's no air conditioning in a lot of these people's houses, they all sit outside in the middle of the day in the shadows outside their housing. And unlike Europe, a lot of people like having their pictures taken, I found, when you sort of leave Europe. And this was one of those occasions where I was walking along, they all caught my eye, and I just asked them, I went, do you mind if I take your picture? And they gave me a smile. I took a couple of shots. And again, in black and white, it's so forgiving. I was able to overexpose it because we were in the shadows. I was able to push it, but also that horrible, I think it was a lime green wall. You don't see it at all. It now becomes a kind of neutral gray or white. So again, really forgiving. You know, there's nothing wrong with any white wall in the world. I think Ross Halfin, the band photographer, said that once. No matter where you are in the world, you can always find a good white wall. And I highly agree with you there. Okay, so it feels a little bit more classic and less like a snapshot. So if this shot here was a color shot, it would feel more like a Martin Parr shot. I mean, no, so not so humorous like his stuff, a little bit more serious. So this was shot in Brighton, obviously big homeless problem out there. This was a couple of summers ago. And if it was in color, again, that wall wouldn't work for me so well. The tonal range wouldn't be so nice. But in black and white, it feels like I'm trying to document something that's going on. There's a little story here. There's a nice bit of empty space. There's obviously the clothes drying on the rails. There's the begging box out the front, but there's still young lovers cuddling each other, wrapped up. Kind of safe and warm. It's a really lovely image. I love this one. And I think if it's in color, it just wouldn't feel like that classic street photography that I'm after. Berlin. So a few years ago, I did a project in Berlin and I shot everything on my beautiful Pen F. And I took two lenses with me, a 12 and a 17, because I wanted to travel light. And I shot everything in camera, black and white. I also obviously shot RAWs that I can go back to afterwards, but these are the in-camera black and whites. And the reason I loved the Pen F so much was because I could really tailor it more than any of our other cameras. I could play around with the red or the yellow spectrum. There's a really nice graph that you could tweak while doing this. You could even add the vignette and the film grain as you went. And as you can see with this image, I've done all of those and I've pushed my highlights. And again, I'm going to run through all of that on the back of the camera when we get to that point. Okay, so you can be more forgiving about your the color and the direction you're shooting in, let's say, with black and white. This shot here, it's all about that decisive moment. It's all about that seagull being lodged off that bin by the guy putting out his cigarette butt. So that's the decisive moment. I took 3 or 4 shots. Originally, he was patrolling the bins, and then he was pushed off by the human. But in color, this shot would be awful. The whites are totally blown. I'm shooting in the wrong direction for the light. And the bins, I think, were either a red or a green. So none of it worked. But in black and white, I'm able to push the highlights right up so you can see the bird properly. We can see light through the bird's wings. We can see the guy's face, whereas in color he'd just be a complete silhouette to try and get that tone right down. So again, it's far more forgiving for your lighting. And you can't hide behind those primary colors or that really obvious kind of ghost color wheel that you can play with in photography. The image on the left was shot in Berlin. That's a hole through the Berlin Wall. And again, the reason I've taken this shot is obviously there's a new building behind it, mirroring a different kind of circle. And I liked the old and the new sat together with a little bit of sort of metal sticking out. It's just a lovely example of texture. And again, that's something you just don't really get with color unless the light is absolutely superb. The one on the right is one of my local yew trees, and that was shot with a 75mm 1.8. I quite like using unconventional lenses. 75 is a 150, and it's traditionally a portrait lens, but again, used in a slightly more interesting way, as close as I could physically get to this yew tree. It gives it a really nice surreal look. And again, in black and white, with yew trees, you start to get faces and patterns that you can use creatively that you probably wouldn't have seen in color. And again, using Olympus, you can see this all in the viewfinder as you do it. Another image in Brighton. This is sort of the local homeless, and the guy has fallen over and banged his head. And I just loved the compassion. All of his mates were straight there to help him. And the thing I liked about this is it's quite a subtle homeless shot. You can tell they're homeless because obviously there's a few cuts on the guy's head in front. There's alcohol to the left hidden away. There's feet leaving the frame. So you can tell they're kind of dejected people. But I love the camaraderie in the shot. I like the rule of thirds. I like the rhythm of the curve. And again, in color, it just wouldn't really feel like a documentary timeless shot without that. Okay, ND photography. So if I'm not doing street photography, I love ND photography. I love moving water. This one is taken over in Bath. And again, this was done on one of my photo walks. This is a Lee 10-stopper filter, and using the lifetime feature in the camera, you can see it live updating in the viewfinder. I also do it in black and white in the camera as I do it. So I pull down my highlights, I deepen my shadows, I play with contrast. So it means I can nail it straight away. This is pretty much the JPEG straight out of camera. So again, it's going to give you a little bit more to play with when you can do these sorts of things. And if you want to walk through anything like lifetime, feel free to book a one-to-one with me for any point in the next week or so, and I can run you through anything. No question's a silly question. If there's anything that you're not sure about today, then book a one-to-one and I'll gladly run through it with you. Okay, yeah, natural surrealism. So the one on the left is Brighton Pavilion, built for one of the princes, one of the Georgian princes, as a sort of play palace, kind of built Brighton as a location to go to, actually. And this puddle is one of those puddles that appears every winter. So this shot I've taken many times with different people in, with or without people. But this one was taken with a low depth of field. I think it was using the 1240 at 2.8. And I focused just on the puddle, just on the reflection. So the background is soft, the foreground is soft, and it has a really nice film look to it when you look at it as a print. Again, really harking back to film photography. I want my digital to look film-like. I'm not too HDR into it or graphic. I want things to look as close as they did when I was shooting film, but with the ease of digital. And again, you get a nice still bit of water. It means you can sit your camera right by it. And again, using the Olympus EM1 range, I'm able to sit in puddles with it. And again, it's completely weather sealed. And then you've got the reverse of that. You've got an f/22, nice close to the puddle, nice clean, sharp the whole way through. But yeah, puddles and primes work really well. This one's up by Guildford. And this is one of those occasions where I probably wouldn't have had a camera with me if I was still shooting big old chunky Nikon DSLRs. But I had a nice 25mm 1.8 on an EM10. I think it was an EM10 Mark II at this point. We're now on the new EM10 Mark IV. And again, it's one of those things that you can get into your coat pocket, or you can have it in your bag with you ready. And it was a stormy day, awful photography, but I got that one moment where suddenly the light came out and I'm stood outside a shop, and there is the clock tower perfectly reflected in this puddle. And at 1.8, I'm able to isolate that from the flooring that it's reflected on, and it works really nicely. Again, completely suited to black and white. It doesn't look too bad in color, this one, but for me, it adds that extra layer of subjective surrealism to it. Shallow depths of field. So we obviously do a lovely range of 1.2s, and whenever I can, I will shoot at 1.2. I'll bring the ISO down as low as possible. If I have to, I could shoot with some sort of filter on the front to stop it down if you need to. And again, these are occasions. These were both shot in South Africa, and they were both shot in the middle of the day. And in color, again, all the colors are blown out. The boats don't look right. His jumper, it looks way too highlighted, but in that shallow depth of field and in black and white, they have a lovely classic feel to them. The fisherman on the left, I asked if I could take his picture, and he just pulled this brilliant expression. I didn't need to do anything else. I'd nailed it first shot. The guy with the seal was one of those shots where I lurked around for a bit longer and took multiple versions with and without the tourists. But I really liked this one in particular. And again, a bit more depth of field on this one worked really nicely. So I can then see the boats where he's getting the fish and the township in the background where he lives. So it's got a nice bit of context to it. But again, in black and white, it saves the day, and it gives it that proper, what I would call documentary feel, respectful documentary feel. British weather works better in black and white. Well, we get a lot of weather. We've been quite lucky the last few years with some beautiful summers, but generally you've always got a good cloud in this country. Very much reminds me of Constable's paintings, when sometimes when you look outside, even today's a bit like that. And this is down near me in Chichester. And I've got a project on the go at the moment where I'm photographing the spire, because it's visible from the sea, but it's also visible from many angles. And this is one of my ones shot near me down by the harbour. And again, because it's in black and white, the clouds look good. With the higher contrast that I've added, that I'm going to show you how to do, the whites really pop. And again, this was using the 45 1.2. I'm able to create a really lovely shallow depth of field in the front and in the back. And in fact, the front really looks reminiscent of Victorian style photography. So that really works nicely for me. Okay, old school landscapes. So this one is completely cheating. This is all done in the camera using the art filters. So this was before we had dramatic tone in black and white. So we had dramatic tone in color, and I'd really, in color, it was a bit much for me, to be honest with you. But then when I shot it and turned it into black and white afterwards, I was really impressed, because you could put the edging on as you shot the picture. In the later models, and now on all of the current models, you can now do dramatic tone in black and white. I highly recommend it, with the edging on as well, around it as well. It really starts to feel a bit Ansel Adams. And again, with this feature, you really want to massively overexpose it, because it has got a massive tendency to make the clouds incredibly dark. But it's really fun to play with. I was addicted to this for a good 5 or 6 months. And there's a lot of landscape I shot in this kind of format. You've also got a grainy black and white effect, which is the image on the right. And again, using grainy black and white with edging means you can shoot things, you completely isolate them by overexposing the sky or the backgrounds, and then it's pulled in by the edging. That pulls your print right back in. And again, the one on the left is dramatic tone in black and white down by Brighton Pier. And again, just really works well on those grim days that we get a lot of in this country. Still life, again, I mentioned Newman to you. This isn't really a Newman style one, but I love still life in black and white. It's amazing what you can do with symbolism and some subtle expression. There's a lot of, particularly in fine art painting, there's a big history of still life and what the symbolism of objects sitting next to each other can mean. And when I'm playing around with sort of still life, black and white, I very much feel that kind of thing going on. And I'm going to show you an example of this once we're done. And again, more fine art, over and under exposing in black and white works so much better than color. So the fig tree on the left was shooting directly up at a tree, and I've overexposed this by, I think, 3 to 4 stops. I think it was the full 3. And again, I couldn't see anything in the leaves before that. I've got rid of the sky completely, and it's even pulled out some lovely, almost kind of X-ray looking quality to the leaves. So it worked really nicely. And then the one next to it's completely the reverse. This is where I'm photographing, again, a lake. This is Petworth Park, not far from me, in sort of middle of West Sussex. And I've underexposed it by 2 stops or 3 stops. And again, what I've done there is I've been able to really burn it in, and it starts looking more like a ink drawing or some sort of wet painting. Decisive moments. So this again is going back to Berlin, all shot in black and white, got a lovely look to it. And again, it's just waiting. Those people, often with street photography, you don't need to have the people facing you. You can use them as your viewer. So these guys were sat there having a bottle of beer, and I just lurked in the background waiting for something to happen. I liked the gas pipes to the left, the way they do it in Berlin. I don't know quite why they're like that, but they're everywhere. So I framed that up as my rule of thirds, and I was waiting for my red balloon moment to happen. And lo and behold, here came one of those U-Bahn, sort of trains. They're one of their local U-Bahn trains. And again, I've got a shot of it coming all the way over. And this is the one that worked for me because it's starting to hit my decisive moment point, my rule of thirds. Okay, let me just switch the feeds, and I will now show you how to do all of this on the camera. While we're here, has anybody got any questions on what I've shown? Okay, brilliant. Let me just switch over the screens. I'm just plugging the HDMI into the back of my EM1 Mark III, and I'm going to stop sharing screens now and switch on the camera. 1 second, everybody. Brilliant. Okay, so I am back with the back of my screen. So how do we create these lovely in-camera black and whites? This is how I do it using my super control panel. So I press OK on my super control panel. So 90% of what you need on an Olympus camera is on the back here. You can adjust these settings by pressing OK and jumping into them, or you can run the front dial where your finger is and adjust the settings like that. And I do a lot of that looking through the viewfinder, because I can press OK, I'll see this in my viewfinder, and I will then do it on the front dial without having to move it from my face. With black and whites or anything, I generally start somewhere around 500 ISO. Just it means I've got a nice fast shutter speed. And what I've done is I've come over to this very far corner here. Normally you'd be in natural or vivid. I've gone over to M for monochrome. So this is our built-in black and white feature. Press OK on that. We're now into M for monochrome. I will then tweak some of these bits here. So there's a few things here that generally people don't really tweak, but they're well worth playing with, because you can do a lot in the camera. So firstly, what have I done first? Okay, firstly, I'm on single shot with manual override. Generally, I will shoot with single shot manual override. I'm using a pro lens, so I can pull back the ring to go manual, but I generally like to be able to just do it, tweaking it without having to do that. It's something that you might have to change in the settings, and I will show you where that is. If you press menu and you go to cog and you go into your A1, on some of the EM1 Mark II and Mark III, you just have to switch it on there. So it's that way out the box will be off. You then just want to pop that on. It's useful to have. It's a very old school way of working. A couple of other bits while we're here. Your back button focus is set here. And also, if you're doing wildlife, your continuous AF sensitivity is set here as well. And I often have that on +2, which is a little bit more bitey for the smaller birds I like to photograph. But I digress. So let's come back. So I'm going to press my shutter, come back out. Okay, so got my ISO on 500. I've got it on M for monochrome. I'm going to tweak the sharpness just by a +1. There we go, +1. I'd highly recommend that if you're also using some of the better value stuff, some of the entry-level lenses. It just gives you a little bit more sharpness. I will then push the contrast +1 here as well. Other features you can play around with here. You can go into here and play around with the graduation. You can have it on normal, high or low. I generally leave it on auto or normal. It doesn't really affect the black and whites too much, but this is where I do start playing around very happily with the black and whites. So F for filter. In the old film days, I would be putting a glass sheet, like an ND filter, in front of my black and whites to give them a better look. I'd put it in yellow for a wedding, because this will give me a nicer looking portrait on the skins. It will also soften the dress down a bit. And then if you go to red, you get completely the opposite. And as a street photographer, I'm kind of into the grittier side of things. Red is the far end of the spectrum. And what that means is that the shadows will be way darker. They'll be filled in. You'll get good silhouettes. So I like a good red. And then a green, again, is slightly softer. So play around with those to get different effects in the camera. Again, if you want to, of course, you could shoot all of this in RAW. But what I would suggest off the back of what I'm presenting today is shoot a RAW and a JPEG, because you can always use that in-camera JPEG to work your RAW up to a certain quality. But I find the in-camera JPEGs, particularly when I've tweaked them like this, are just absolutely blinding. Next to that, you've got tone. And again, you can add a sepia tone if you're into your steam trains. Blue tone, which is very kind of Hollywood. It makes me think of sort of 24 and these kind of more government conspiracy related TV. You've got a purple one and a green one. I'm not overly keen on either of those, but certainly the blue and the sepia are good fun to play with. I'd recommend you play around with those. You can also play around with your aspect ratio. 4:3 is the best out of our camera, and it's kind of a square format. But if you were an old Canon user, you can go to a 3:2. I often like shooting in a 1:1 because I just love the square format. It means you don't play with the rule of thirds so much, but you certainly can play around with symmetry in a different way. Metering wise, I will use evaluated metering for 90% of my work. But if I needed to, I would shoot with center weighted, and you can use that for a portrait or if you were shooting maybe a gig or something like that. But most, and wildlife, birds and things like that. Macro it works really well on because you want to focus particularly on the exposure for that central bit that you're focused on. But most of the time I go for evaluated metering, and I'll over and underexpose on the front dial while using aperture priority on my back dial. This is where we're going to make our black and white look outstanding. We click into here and you've got the ability to control the highlights and the shadows. If I press the info button, I can also control the midtones. Press the info button again and I can jump between this. And this will apply to all of the OMD cameras. So on the front dial, I normally push my highlights by 2 stops, but I have been known to go all the way. So I'm going to bring that back down to 2. Again, I'm just giving you advice to then go and tweak it at home and make it look superb. Shadows are currently, I find all digital cameras sort of underexposed shadows. I suppose I'm so used to film from back in the day. So my shadows, I will drop 2 or 3. So let's go for 2 for the setup that I've got today. I can then press info and tweak the midtones. And what I'll often do, if I push the highlights really far, so I've gone really far in the highlights, like to 3 or 4, what you could then do is go info and just pull your midtones down just a pinch, and it will repair some of those super high bits that are well blown. So again, tinker around with that. But I generally use that on the middle, and I'm going to bring my high tone just down to a 2 again, press OK, and voila, we are at a really nice, tasty black and white. So what I'm going to do now is show you how this works in reality.
Yeah, Jess, can I ask a question,
Please
please?
do.
Yes, I see that you've got RGB there.
Yes.
On mine, I've got mine set to Adobe.
Yes.
I had the same question.
Yeah, so what's right?
Oh, that's good, isn't it? That's a good question. So yeah, if you're using some of the Adobe programs, if you use it with Adobe, it's just going to give you a little bit more spectrum to play with color, basically.
Right, because I use Lightroom most of the time.
Yeah, so Lightroom's part of the Adobe family now, isn't it? So
yeah.
I would shoot with Adobe, to be honest with you. Okay. Absolutely. I'm still using a very old-fashioned software called Aperture, so that's why I generally shoot on RGB. I think generally, by rule of thumb, RGB was used by poster printers and kind of typography people, and then obviously when we went digital, they just came up with a slightly different version for Adobe. But try both. I'd be interested to hear your differences.
Okay, thank you, Jess.
That's all right. Anybody else? Okay, brilliant. Let me just move to the example I want to show you then. So I'll shoot this in color and in black and white, and then we can look at the differences. Okay, and then I will answer a few questions that I've got here. Okay, so let me just lift my camera up. Apologies, I'm going to get a sweep of my living room. Here we go. All these lovely HDMI wires. Okay, so what I've set up here is I have literally got, 1 second, I just need to move my square around. Okay, let's go to, right, I'm going to have to shoot it landscape for you guys to see it properly. Okay, so let me come into here. So all I've got here is a little still life set up, and I've got a little 1-point light there that works really nicely, just plugged into the mains, and then I'm using that lovely stuff called daylight out there. Very simple, still lifey stuff. But what I want to show you here is what you can get when you have a black and white versus a color. So let's bring that in and do 1, 2, 3. Lovely. And now I'm going to press OK, bring up my super control panel and turn that into color. So I shot that at f2, so I've dialed it down just a spot. From 1.2, but I could shoot it at 1.2 as well. And now let's go with natural, completely kind of natural out of the camera. So as you can see, those tungsten lights, I've got them on a slightly warm setting, but they work quite nicely. 1, 2, 3, there we go. Right, and what I'm going to do is pop the camera down and we will have a little look at the differences here. Oh, sorry about that. There we go. Great. So there's color and there's black and white. There's color and there's black and white. And for me, the black and white works way more. So as you can see, the highlights are a bit burnt out here. So I should probably drop the exposure slightly. So let's try that. So 1 second, let me bring that down a couple. There we go. And let's try that again. So bring up my black and white. There we go, lovely. There we go, that's looking way better. So again, I've just stopped it right down. Bring that into focus. Bring it up a tiny bit more. Great. And press OK. Yeah, much better. So color. Apologies about the lead, doing the little jump around. So that was the original, and then I've just taken it down a little bit. And again, I'm just getting a nice, moody black and white. There we go. Right, everybody. Has anybody got any questions?
Jess, can I ask something?
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt before, but when you said about single shot with the manual override,
Yes.
I go in and I've got single shot AF, but I haven't got the single shot in the manual override. I'm on the Mark III.
Yeah, so you've got the Mark III. So yeah, if you come into COG, A1, and then go down one, it should be there. You see where I've lit it up in green? Oh, the sound's gone now.
Got it now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Okay, let me have a look at some of these questions that you guys have asked me. So 1 second. So one of you just asked me about a tutorial that you've done. I will find out for you on that one, absolutely. So no problem, brilliant, great. I will find out, I'll give Claire a ring on that one. Okay, so lifetime, what's this? Okay, that's a great question. Actually, Rihanna, do you want to give me, should we do a one-to-one on that one? Is that all right? Yep. Brilliant. Yeah, if you could send me an email, you've got my email, we'll arrange a one-to-one this week and I'll walk you through that. Okay. What lights am I using? I am using one of those Chinese brands, one of the third-party ones, Nanqiao. I bet I'm butchering that completely. But they were very cheap, very reasonable, ideal for this sort of thing. The Pen F can have a various film simulations in mono. Are there any specific settings to adjust the curves to give similar settings? If you have a look online, I bet you there's a few recommendations on that, but the key one I played around with on that was definitely the red, pulling the red around and then adjusting the green as well at the same time. And again, when you bring up your super control panel on that one, when you're in black and white, somewhere about here, you have the ability to add film grain to it as well. So that would work really nicely as well. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for your time. It's very much appreciated. And anybody that wants to do a follow-up with me on a one-to-one, you're more than welcome. But thank you very much for your time. Stay safe, everyone. And I will send you a link to have a copy of the recording. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye.